So, Professor Bill Carroll, thank you for accepting my invitation to be interviewed on the 25th anniversary of the foundation of the CSPT program. And you have been a founding member of the CSPT program. Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask you a few things about the way CSPT came to be.
Okay.
And it's lovely to talk to you about that. So let me start by asking you a question about yourself. I would like to know the Bill Carroll, mm-hmm. who came to University of Victoria, and how you ended up, being here.
Right. Well, the Bill Carroll who came to the University of Victoria in the fall of 1981 was a newly minted PhD from York University, Sociology. York was one of the more politically progressive and active campuses in Canada. Had a very strong student movement in the 60s right through the 70s when I was a graduate student there. And so I, absorbed a lot of influences at York, of course, including a very strong interest in Marxism. And I, as a graduate student, I became quite involved in an educational collective called the Marxist Institute in Toronto that had faculty members from York and U of T and Ryerson and graduate students and some people who were not necessarily academically affiliated. And we were sort of trying to do a lot of popular education and study groups, reading Volume 1 of Capital or Volume 2. I read the different volumes of Capital in these Marxist Institute study groups and led some study groups in terms of introduction to Marxism. And we would have various visiting speakers come by, like Perry Anderson and Ralph Miliband, and sponsor them and have these, try to bring the left together in a very open way and have these forums in terms of, the left at that time was very sectarian, very divided into sectarian groups, the Maoists and the Trotskyists and so on and so forth. It was that kind of echo of the new left in the late 1970s. So anyway, I absorbed a lot of those kinds of political influences and came to UVic, went through a kind of culture shock process, I would say, in my first year here, because I was moving from Kensington Market area of Toronto, one of the most multicultural places in North America at the time, certainly, to Oak Bay, Victoria, behind the Tweed Curtain. And so, that was part of my introduction to Victoria, a very different place from downtown Toronto. But it was an interesting kind of transition in that first year. And I tried to, looking back on it, I tried to sort of sustain the same kinds of left community activities that existed in Toronto and try to generate them here with graduate students and so on and so forth. And so we had a kind of study group and we were reading Volume 1 of Capital, for a while, my first year. But it sort of petered out. There wasn't really the capacity to make it go anywhere, So it was, it was in some ways fairly quiet existence in that first year. And then, I was basically, I got the job because my dissertation was very empirical, very well documented work and so on and so forth, painstaking kind of tracing these networks of corporate elites in Canada, right? And I presented it as a kind of critique. Well, it was a critique of the work of Wally Clement, but it was a left critique. But some of the department members who were, it wasn't a very, sociology department was rather conservative at the time and very positivistic. They sort of read my critique as a critique of Marxism to some extent. So it was interesting. I sort of, it wasn't exactly a false flag operation, but it was an interesting way of getting the job, put it that way, without really misrepresenting in any kind of intentional way. I certainly downplayed the radicalism in my own analysis to try to, present myself as acceptable to mainstream sociological future colleagues. And I mean, UVic was a very quiet place politically in the early 1980s and a much smaller place. I would say it didn't take long to become aware of the interesting larger political scene in British Columbia, which was very interesting in terms of the left-right politics of this province. That continued to this day, but that were very, very sharp in the late 70s and through the 1980s. BC had the strongest labor movement in North America, highest union density in North America. And it was divided into some, fairly conservative, if you like, sort of business union kinds of operations, but also some very radical unions. And so anyway, a fairly strong social democratic party. The NDP was, had a program of progressive reform that was credible, and that a large proportion of the electorate supported. So that was interesting and different from Ontario, quite different in that respect. So it was a kind of a mixed experience for me moving out to British Columbia in 1981.
How was you mentioned a little bit about sociology department in which you landed?
Yes.
Could you elaborate on how sociology looked like, how big it was, and so on?
Sure. We had 12 members of the department, as I recall. We now have 17. So we've grown a bit, but not very dramatically in like 33 years. But the 12 were, the center of gravity was American-style positivist sociology. Most of the people in the department had gotten their PhDs in the United States. Some of them were American citizens who had moved to Canada. Some were Canadians who had studied at Harvard or something like that, University of Minnesota. The departmental, it wasn't a complete consensus in the department, but the hegemonic group was very positivistic and very hostile to theory, especially critical theory, which they did not consider to be part of the terrain of sociology. So, of course, any kind of CSPT type project faced a real uphill battle within the sociology department at that time. It was, it was not completely uniform in that way. So there were a few dissidents, if you like, in the department. It was a kind of center margin dynamic. There was a kind of a ruling group who were very closely affiliated with each other, sort of hung out together, that kind of thing. And then there were people in the margins, some of whom were a bit more, interested in perhaps theory or interested in other ways of doing sociology. But I'm just talking about 3 or 4 people of 12. And very much a kind of department concerned about method in the narrow sense of empirical method, and emphasizing empirical method over theoretical and broader methodological issues. Theory viewed as a kind of instrument for deriving one's hypothesis. That kind of approach to thinking about what theory is and what the purpose of theorizing might be. A very small graduate program that was pretty demanding. We actually required our students to take 8 graduate courses. Well, they could take, I think, 1 or 2 upper-level undergraduate, but they had to take 8 courses and write a thesis. So we didn't have a lot of students in the graduate program or in the honors program. I don't know, was that kind of department, one of the members of my committee who actually helped get me the job because he came out to UVic as a Lansdowne lecturer, and we had been collaborating on a project, and so he really talked me up when he was doing his Lansdowne lecture, and they then invited me out for a job interview. That's how I actually ended up here. But this was Bernard Blishen, but when he came back from his little visit to University of Victoria, he described it as a backwater and a place that would not be very interesting. Which is, to some extent, I think, fairly accurate description of UVic in 1981, or UVic sociology, I shouldn't say the entire institution.
Now that brings me to actually another question.
Yes.
That, given that you were actually some kind of a out of place person,
yes,
at sociology department here.
Mm-hmm.
How did the dynamics of your critical approach in a context that recognized sociology to be only a very sort of narrow approach of sort of American positivist empirical sociology, which is of course part of sociology, but sociology is not reducible to that. Mm-hmm. How did that work for you? Like in terms of you're a critical thinker who has a Marxist analysis of corporate networks in Canada.
Yeah.
Then you land in this department, and how did that work out for you, like personally mm-hmm. and intellectually?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think in a sense, perhaps part of the reason why the network that became CSPT came together was partly because we were refugees from other places converging on this place. And certainly just speaking for myself, I was very much a small minority. My own perspective was very much minoritarian within sociology. But if I could connect with Warren Magnuson or Rob Walker and other people in other departments, we could do some interesting things. And so that I think was one of the motives, sort of in the background, an ambient kind of aspect of the situation. It was, as I say, somewhat of a lonely existence. We actually, how things can operate at different levels. And so although there was this kind of positivist center to the department, there were also a number of amateur musicians, myself included. We formed a band. And so we could sort of develop some, friendship and solidarity across what might otherwise have been barriers, right? Through collaborating in music. And we would play at students' parties and stuff like that. It was sort of interesting. And definitely, a way of sort of supplementing, what was somewhat barren in terms of intellectual, collegial, relationships this is particularly in the first year or so that we had the band. It didn't continue for a long time.
Who was in the band?
Who was in the band? The bass player was a guy named Andy Shand, really brilliant guy. He was doing his MA here, and he was from Great Britain, student of Rennie Warburton's, and he himself was a Marxist as well. So Andy and I were sort of on the left of the band, and he was a professional musician. He was performing around town as well. So it was fortunate that we had him in the band because he knew what he was doing. And then we had Morgan Baker on drums, and David Gartrell on keyboard, and an honor student joined the band partway through as really, because I'm a guitarist but not a great guitarist, and this guy is a very good guitarist, and also has played professionally, Zane Shannon. He went on to do a PhD in education here at UVic, actually. So that was our band, the Talking Dogs, and we would play parties and various kinds of things. I remember performing The Boy from Ipanema which I changed the lyrics to so that there was sort of a kind of a satirical take on Alan Headley, who was chair at the time, and the sports car that he drove around town and everything. So I remember singing that to Alan at one of our parties. So, it was a way of sort of cutting across what might have otherwise been deeper divisions that actually did begin to develop, partly in the wake of CSPT.
It's very interesting for me that you actually describe, the sort of founders or founding members of CSPT as refugees, in this place, which basically you were out of place in this place, right? And therefore you were sort of in need of creating something new that would kind of relate to your experience and your exilic experience actually right here. So can you sort of describe that a little, like in terms of the intellectual ambience of the founding sort of moment of CSPT?
Yeah. I think the background to it is that in the late 1970s and early 80s, myself as one example, Warren is another one, pretty well, most of the people who were active in founding CSPT were in this category of, as you say, people coming from away and settling here all of a sudden. So there was a recruitment of a number of people with critical, theoretical kinds of perspectives in the late 70s, early 80s. So people were there, were here. And the context was one of a kind of left-right politics in British Columbia surrounding what we were doing here within the university. And then really things coming to a head in 1983 when there was a provincial election. And the election was won by the Social Credit Party. They had already been in power since 1975 when the Barrett government fell. But this election was really an important turning point because it was in the wake of that the social credit government introduced the so-called reform, restraint program, not reform, restraint program. And the restraint program was a package of 26 bills that they brought down, I think in May of 1983, if I remember correctly. And this was really the first coherent neoliberal political program in North America. You could say, well, Reagan was already in power and so on and so forth. But in a sense, what they were doing was distilling a lot of things that had been developing south of the border and especially in Thatcherite Britain and putting it into a very coherent, in their way of thinking about the world, very coherent package for basically gutting trade unionism in the public sector and drastically reducing public programs, so shrinking the state in that sense, and moving toward a low tax regime and everything. And it was all, the context of this was that BC went into a very deep recession. The entire world, of course, went into a recession after the Volcker shock in 1982. But in particular, BC, the unemployment rate was, the official unemployment rate was like 17-18% here in 1982, going into 1983. And so this was an abandonment of the Keynesian paradigm of saying, well, what we need to do in times of downturn is to stimulate the economy, right? Try to get effective demand pumped up so that there's a bit of a recovery rather than a free fall. But the Social Credit Party actually embraced the neoliberal model, particularly in 1983. So that stirred an enormous amount of political opposition in the form of Operation Solidarity on the part of Coalition of Trade Unions and the Solidarity Coalition, which was a coalition of social movements, human rights, gay and lesbian liberation, Aboriginal communities, various, groups, tenant associations and so on and so forth. And so basically the two were aligned, Operation Solidarity, Solidarity Coalition. And so this period of spring 1983 right into the fall of 83 was a period of political crisis in BC, because the movement was, sections of the movement were actually trying to bring down the government. And there was an escalating general strike, political strike, in November of 1983. And eventually a deal was cut by Jack Monroe of the International Woodworkers with Bill Bennett, who was the premier, the Kelowna Accord and all of that. So in the wake of all that, I personally became very involved politically in the Solidarity Coalition. I was quite active. As far as I know, I was the only UVic faculty member who was quite active in the Solidarity Coalition. And they brought me on the board of directors of the Faculty Association, actually, in the wake of that, although it was a very sleepy kind of faculty association at the time, so nothing really came of that. But I was sort of, I guess I was recognized on campus a little bit as someone who was not so much radical, but politically engaged in this kind of democratic struggle, because most people on campus here were very much opposed to the restraint program, which was, of course, an attack on universities as much as anything, right? So I don't know if that helps in terms of giving a sense of the kind of context, because the group that formed the network that led to CSPT was the group that put out this book, put it on camera, The New Reality. And so our group, we called ourselves the Committee on Alternatives for British Columbia. And Warren Magnuson was definitely the spearhead of this group and the lead editor of this book, and also a second book that came out in 1986. This was published in 1984 and was a BC bestseller called The New Reality, The Politics of Restraint in British Columbia. And what we did was to mobilize a network of colleagues, mainly at UVic, to write chapters in this book that were critiques of the social credit restraint program, of this kind of neoliberal program. And we collectively wrote, mostly Warren really did the writing for the most part, a introduction and conclusion that was a frame of the whole thing politically. So it wasn't really a theoretical work, but it brought together a network that included 4 of the 6 founding members of CSPT, from sociology, political science, and philosophy, which were the 3 founding departments. So it was a kind of infrastructure that developed in 1984 and continued. Like we did these 2 books. I wasn't really involved much in the second book, but we also did other things. We were sort of preparing briefs that were presented at left conferences and basically really trying to intervene in practical policy debates in the province. So that was kind of our project. As I say, much more a practical political project than a theoretical project. But obviously theoretically informed and critical in its perspective.
How did the idea of creating an interdisciplinary theory, graduate theory program came to your minds in this context, given the context in which you just described, like how did that translate into creating a sort of interdisciplinary program that later became, I think the program was called originally Contemporary Social Thought, Social and Political Thought. Right?
Yeah.
So,
I would again put it down to primarily Warren's agency. He was really the leader in this. He was a leader in CABC. And then as I recall, it was the fall of 1986. I could have that wrong, but that's, I think, the case, when he floated the idea of a interdisciplinary critical theory program. And we began to meet, we being people like Monica Langer from philosophy, and Rob Walker, and Warren Magnuson, Randy Warburton, and myself from sociology, and John Mickelson from philosophy as well. So basically 6 of us, 2 from each of the 3 departments, began to meet and talk about what this might amount to, how it could be set up. We didn't talk a lot about, sort of, substantive theoretical issues of, what would be, the flagship theory or something like that. It was always, I think, from the start conceptualized as pretty broad, wide-ranging, and purposefully that way, open, critical and open kind of approach to interdisciplinary theory in social sciences and humanities, social and political thought. It was meant to have a contemporary focus, so it was CSPT. We were mindful of the existence of SPT at York, Social and Political Thought, very big established program at York University, which is my alma mater. And we didn't want to, simply try to replicate what York was doing. And in particular, since we didn't have much in the way of resources, and we didn't feel that we could do a really big ask for resources, we purposefully designed the program in a way to make it quite lightweight, not intellectually, but in terms of, financial requirements, or human resource requirements, right? Make it quite lightweight, and then we won't be turned down. That was our strategy. And in a sense, it's a strategy that haunts us to this day, because UVic has, I think, claimed credit for this program as a kind of flagship program in its graduate, programming. But it's given very little support to it in terms of real, tangible resources. The program is successful largely due to what we might call sweat equity of the faculty members and everybody in the CSPT community, as you know. That's how it works. But that was sort of structured into it from the start, because we, particularly in that era, because it was this era of extreme financial restraint, right? There was no money, we wanted to launch this program and make it viable. And we were aware of the fact that it couldn't really claim a lot of new resources. So the other thing was, in terms of, I might be getting ahead of myself here, but in terms of designing the program, we wanted to make it work for students in a way that the York program sometimes, and we were aware, had some possible problems, which was that one would graduate with a degree in social and political thought, which would not really give a disciplinary credential to the student, which can be a problem, not necessarily. But so CSPT here was designed to be a kind of enhancement to degree programs, and rather than a freestanding program. And partly because of lack of resources, but partly because of our thinking that would be a good way to set it up from a student perspective.
On the practical side, how did you approach your departments and sort of kind of ask or encourage them to join the program? I think that probably would have been the greatest impediment for
Yes, it was really a cliffhanger, I would say, particularly for sociology, somewhat for philosophy too, because philosophy was largely an analytical philosophy department. So, the more continental approaches to philosophy were not very strongly represented in philosophy. And John Mickelson and Monica Langer had those approaches, but they were definitely a minority in their department. And in fact, philosophy pulled out ultimately. Maybe that's an oversimplification to say they pulled out, but there was lukewarm interest on the part of philosophy. They did agree to participate. Then they closed down their graduate program for a few years. And when they started up again, it was without CSPT. Something like that is my recollection
Right.
of how it played out. But in sociology, it was a real struggle, and in fact, a struggle against the odds to get CSPT approved by our department here. As I say, we had 12 members of the department, most of them steeped in American positivism, hostile to this very initiative, the very idea that sociology would have anything to do with this. It's beyond the pale. And so I was aware of how tenuous the situation was, and Rennie Warburton was certainly aware. And we talked about it and thought, well, we're just going to go for it. We're going to try. We're going to try to let reason prevail, and have had a department meeting. This was in the spring of 1987, I think in April. We had a meeting scheduled, and I asked to have put on the agenda a motion to that sociology participate in this new planned program, not yet approved, but under planning in CSPT. So the motion came up at the meeting, and it's just a really good example of how, I think in political life, even these kinds of politics, you can't give up hope. Like we live in almost desperate times right now, and I know my students often, express desperation. But you really can't give up hope, and this is a good example because here we have a department just steeped in American-style positivism, hostile to the CSPT project. And what happened was this: the eminence grise in the department, Bob Hagedorn, who was completely opposed to CSPT, right? He decided to, in April, take a bit of a vacation. He went down to San Francisco. So he didn't figure there was any hope that CSPT could pass, right? A majority vote. So he wasn't around. Then I had been talking with a colleague, Mary Gallant, who was actually she was the only untenured faculty member at the time. She was feeling tremendous pressure to vote against CSPT. And I talked a lot with her, and so I didn't know how she would vote. She ended up abstaining. And the key thing, though, was that a very, very conservative colleague, Rick Ogmanson, who was just adamantly opposed to CSPT, wrote a memo that was so outrageous, it was hysterical, it was paranoid, it was really way over the top. And he put it in everybody's mailbox before the meeting, denouncing the CSPT proposal and identifying it as the thin edge of a wedge that would bring terrorism to UVic. He used the term terrorism, okay? So, and then he refused to attend the meeting. So just like Bob Hagedorn, he was pretty confident in the result, right? And the problem is that Ogmanson's memo backfired. So the liberal, the people in the department who weren't so much dyed-in-the-wool American positivists looked at this and said, well, this is an injustice. This is more than an injustice. It's totally irrational, So we're not going to vote down CSPT. We're going to, it's a pretty good proposal. We'll go for it. So we ended up with Rennie and myself and 3 sort of moderates in the department voted for CSPT, 5 in favor, 3 opposed, 1 abstention, and the chair only votes in a tie. So it was, it was not what anybody expected, right? And it was only due to a series of contingencies that nobody could have really predicted. So that's how it went in sociology. And after that, I began a 1-year sabbatical in July 1987. Went to University of Amsterdam for a year. And in the meantime, our department chair at the time tried to, one more time, extricate sociology from CSPT. But fortunately, Rennie Warburton attended the meeting where this happened. This I just know from Rennie's account. And he he called Alan Headley on this and said, "You can't do this. We've already had a democratic vote by the department. It's been recorded in the minutes, blah, blah, blah." And so the dean accepted that, and sociology became one of the founding departments.
To this day?
Yeah.
Yes. Excellent. Very interesting story. Very interesting story.
Yeah.
An example of hegemonic politics. Indeed.
Definitely. Yeah. And the thing is that what it did into our department is that it set up a dynamic of factional politics. Like I would say, sociology became a factionalized department in the wake of that, and it continued for years. That we had, it wasn't necessarily CSPT versus something else, but it was a kind of a logic of factionalization that tended to get replicated over time. If you like, the origin point was then because basically the positivist right lost its hegemony in a certain sense.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Do you want to reflect a little bit on the way CSPT basically came together and was institutionalized? How did the deans receive it? How did the university kind of institutionalize it? As you said, it was a lightweight program. It's a kind of nimble, kind of soft money program, right? And how did how did you approach the deans and everyone else, and how was it received by the deans?
Well, I think Warren is the best source on that for the early years, and then I became director of the program in 1994. So at that point, I started to have direct, communication with the deans, and in particular John Schofield, Dean of Social Sciences, and Ian McPherson at the time was Dean of Humanities. They were both very supportive of the program. They really thought it was a great program, and in fact, John had me attending chairs meetings. So he considered the program important enough that the director of CSPT would be equivalent to a department chair, which is a bit of a stretch, really, when you look at the resources that the program has and so on. But at the same time, they did not really provide more resources, or it just continued to be a soft money program. I mean, the deans agreed to release time for people teaching CSPT 500. And I think we had initially 3 courses per year that we could mount. I believe that's correct. And it was reduced to 2 at some point, as I recall, and then it shifted into a different funding model altogether. But that release time was important, actually, particularly for sociology, because, as I say, it was the actual majority of the department was opposed to CSPT, right? And yet we were participating in it, which was a bit of a paradoxical situation. But Rennie and I were always able to say, well, look, we get this tangible benefit because we actually get an extra course that can be taught. And so like I taught CSPT 500, I think for the second time. Warren taught it the first time in the fall of 1988, then I taught it in January 1999, or 1980, 89, 88, 89. And that was seen as a sort of a bonus for sociology, right? It wasn't a deduction from our teaching load. Anyway, these little things that are pretty trivial can matter, in the micropolitics of a department like sociology.
How did the student recruitment was kind of conceived of, managed? I imagine the first, if memory serves, the first student recruited in 1989 was political science student. But then we have other students joining. How was it advertised? In other words, how did the students get to know that there's a contemporary social and political thought program that may be of interest for me in sociology or political science? How did you go about advertising, and how did you recruit students?
Well, Warren and I designed a really neat poster that had. There's probably a copy of it around somewhere, but it was a like 11 by 17 poster with sort of purplish ink on white paper, and it had all the names of different critical theorists in the background and some sort of graphic in the foreground, I forget. But so we had the poster. We, these were the days of transition to email. I know that I eventually, as soon as I could, I set up an email network of my own in terms of directly communicating with theory teachers in sociology departments across the country. And each year I would send an email, personalized email to each of them saying, we've got this program, it's a new program, it's exciting, please consider sending your students our way, So part of it was that approach, I'm sure we did other things as well, but I'm not sure what. But it was, wasn't that easy to recruit students to the program, particularly into sociology. We didn't have a lot of sociology students in CSPT. Most of the students were in political science initially. Then when English joined, we started getting a fair number of students in English, and really the center of gravity of the program was, in terms of student participation, was political science and English for a number of years. I think more recently it's become somewhat more balanced across the three departments, and now of course it's possible for people to do CSPT without necessarily being in one of those three or more, history in the fourth department. But yeah, that's about the best I could do in explaining the initial kind of communication process, trying to attract students. It's. They were coming from. They weren't necessarily just coming out of UVic undergraduate programs. They were coming from other places. I think maybe Warren and Rob had their own networks as well. So I think we were, tapping into, just personal professional networks that we had to some extent.
Okay, great. How do you think CSPT has changed over the past 25 years? In terms of the courses offered, in terms of the students recruited, it's a very successful graduate theory program. It's a very successful graduate program, period.
Yeah.
And the most stellar students, apply for this program, and yet program has limited resources. So even this most stellar students, only the top students can be admitted to the program. So it really is one of the it's a success story, really, in all respects.
Mm-hmm.
So how did that, how did it transform into what it is now? It's a very successful program, and so on and so forth. And despite all the adversities and despite all lack of support and or shortage of support, maybe not necessarily lack, but how did it change, and how did it become what it is today, now that you reflect back on the origins?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we were always, even in the early years of the program, we were pretty rigorous in terms of recruiting students and accepting students and rejecting applications. So we consciously tried to make it a strong program intellectually, in terms of the students who would be coming in and what we'd be doing in the courses and everything. So that was a conscious strategy, and I think it was effective over time. The program acquired a certain reputation, and so it began to attract a lot of strong applicants over the years. And I think that's where we are now. There are other programs like this, but I think CSPT is seen as as I say, a very successful program, a good place to be. How it's changed, I don't, it's certainly changed in various ways, over a long stretch of 25 years. CSPT has always recruited students who were on the left, I'd say, on the critical side, interested in often sort of cutting edge theoretical issues and very interdisciplinary. But what that means, probably looks different today compared to 25 years ago. It's sort of hard to really summarize what the difference is. I think it went through. It's never really had a kind of singular perspective in terms of what it's all about, and I think it's probably even more diverse today than it was in earlier times. Perhaps in the 90s, I think it was there was a kind of a post-structuralist approach that was pretty central, I think, within CSPT. And I think now it's sort of somewhat more diverse. Like there's more interest in critical political economy today. I had that interest early on, and the courses I've taught have incorporated that and other sort of Gramscian, social movement kind of oriented approaches, which have been incorporated into other courses too. Warren has taught courses, under that kind of rubric as well. But I think I guess it's more diverse today than ever, which is great, partly because of the recruitment of faculty members beyond the initial founding department. So now we have, quite an interesting collection of people in the social sciences and humanities as well as fine arts, So I don't know who else, probably maybe some other faculties.
Yeah. So now reflecting on that diversity, how do you see the future of CSPT?
Well, I hope we can continue to develop in this way, really, in a diverse way. I think there are obviously pressing issues for humanity in the crisis that we're living. So I would hope that CSPT that faculty members and students will take up those challenges of critical theory that is relevant to our epoch, of crisis, organic crisis, and crisis that is multi-level, multiplex crisis. It's much more than economic crisis. It's ecological crisis. It's, some people say, crisis of civilization. Whatever. It's a very complicated and difficult situation that we find ourselves in. And so I think it's good for the program to retain the double C, that is both cultural and contemporary, to keep a focus on theorizing in a way that connects with the challenges we face today.
Are there any things you would like to say about CSPT? Maybe any ideas, any concerns, anything you might have in mind?
Concerns? No, I don't have any real concerns about it. I haven't taught in the program in a number of years. I would love to do that again. It just hasn't really been opportune, just because of other things I've been doing. But every time that I've taught a CSPT 500 seminar, is what I've done in the past, it's been just an amazing experience. It's different from any other teaching assignment in terms of the group of students that comes together and the way in which they interact, their differing backgrounds, and their theoretical critical strengths intellectually, which is fabulous. It's really, it's like dying and going to heaven.
So, Professor Carroll, thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome,
talking on the CSPT 25th anniversary. Thank you.